Welcome everyone to Virtual Insights, Reasserting Black Presence in the Early American North. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billot, Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York, and before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught and folk artists across time and place. Next slide, please. And we are thrilled to offer a new perspective on early American art and material culture with the exhibition Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North, on view at 2 Lincoln Square until March 24th, along with the concurrent exhibition Marvels of My Own Inventiveness. Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North shares the untold stories of Black experience in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, though through over 120 remarkable works, including portraiture, needlework, works on paper, sculpture, photographs, and other vernacular forms from the late 17th century to the mid-19th century. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by the curator of this fantastic exhibition, Emelie Gevalt, curatorial chairs for collections and curator of folk art at AFAM, Dr. Awal Watson, assistant professor of English and African American Studies at Lake Forest College, and Sadé Ayorinde, a Terra Foundation pre-doctoral fellow in American art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, who recently served as Warren Family Assistant Curator at AFAM. So today the curators will walk us through the exhibition and invite us to reconsider a selection of early American objects, images, and archives, positioning the Black figure as a principal subject of inquiry. This curatorial walkthrough will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a short conversation. There will be time for a Q&A, so please share your questions for our speakers throughout the talk using the Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about our speakers, about the program, and if you need any additional information, please drop me in a line in the chat. And before I turn it over to Emelie, RL, and Sadé, please know that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. And we are grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you. I hope you will consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum following this conversation. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. Thank you. And I now will hand it over to our speakers. Please welcome them all.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. And we're really thrilled to be here today. It's especially wonderful to have all 3 members of the curatorial team presenting today on the exhibition Unnamed Figures, which is a project that's been in the making in some form or another for the past 6 years. So it's incredibly exciting to be able to share the results of our research with you. Most broadly speaking, this is a show that looks at African-American representation with a special focus, as Mathilde said, on the understudied area of the 18th and early 19th century North. We can easily recognize that Black figures and faces seldom appear in American art of this time period. When they are represented, they're typically placed in secondary positions, subject to marginalization, and portrayed as lacking in individuality. Often, Black figures go unnamed and are implicitly excluded from the story of a picture. Although initiated by the work's makers and originally intended consumers, this kind of compositional sidelining has been reinforced over time by histories of interpretation with museums and art historians reinscribing through narrative repetition white representations as the dominant point of interest in so many of these pictures. Incorporated into portraits of elite white sitters, enslaved and free Black servants are continually described only as accessories to power. In landscapes, small Black staffage figures have been dismissed as incidental. Countless men, women, and children inhabited these same spaces referenced by such pictures, but were never depicted at all. And so the central question behind the exhibition is, what if we actively choose to refocus our attention, to center interpretation on questions about Black presence and absence, even though the answers may elude us? In reorienting our approach to such depictions and demanding something new from old pictures, we locate symbolic value in early American Black figures for the present moment as cues to the historical presence of Black individuals and their overlooked experiences. With these questions in mind, as Mathilde said, we've gathered over 120 never-before-assembled works of art, including portraiture and landscapes, but also more unexpected forms like needlework, works on paper, sculpture, photographs, and other forms that trace the histories of Black representation as subjects both central and peripheral. As you'll see today, the imagery ranges broadly according to the complex scope of historical depictions of Black people in America. Interpretation directly acknowledges histories of enslavement, racism, and oppression. These hard truths are balanced with opportunities for remembrance, uplifting stories of Black persistence, and powerful, sensitive portrayals. The selection of works gives special focus to early New England and the Mid-Atlantic regions due to historical misperceptions of the 19th century South as the singular site of early Black American history, which is very much a willful misremembering and creation of a mythology that denies histories of slavery in the North. So as an introduction, in the opening gallery, we define the geographical scope of the show through a selection of works from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New York, as well as the northeastern colonies that preceded these states. An example is this depiction from AFAM's own collection, which is quite well known as a highlight of the museum's collection, of the house of a wealthy Massachusetts shipbuilder. Although this image was originally intended, like many similar house portraits, to emphasize the prominence and prosperity of the white property owner, who you can see here in the center of the picture, just atop this emblazoned caption testifying to the fact that this is his property. We have seen that although past interpretations have primarily talked about the picture in these terms, there is also a Black woman in this landscape, perhaps the single person of color recorded as a member of the depicted household in the 1790 census for Massachusetts. Although Black populations in 18th century New England were small, this image indirectly recalls the centrality of the slave trade to building the local economy, which drew its prosperity from the triangular trade with Africa and the West Indies, reliant on Massachusetts exports, in particular of salt cod, and on the production of the Massachusetts shipbuilding enterprise. So although New England is not popularly remembered as what has been called a slave society, its flourishing would have been impossible without the enslaved labor of the Caribbean, and indeed the local enslaved labor of women like the one that we're seeing here. She's enigmatically facing away from the viewer, conjuring as well those under-recognized contributions of Black Northerners who were small in number, but whose work had a major impact on daily life, managing household tasks, and thereby creating time and opportunity for enslavers to pursue their wealth through trade. These underrepresented men and women are essential parts of the fabric of our history. Shifting our focus to center the Black figures in such images, we locate new ways of understanding familiar pictures. This is in the folk art world, an iconic needlework picture, long interpreted in terms of the biography of its maker, Prudence Punderson, the white woman sitting at the center of this composition. This is entitled The First, Second, and Last Scene of Mortality, and it's an autobiographical depiction of the various stages of life from birth to death, represented by the coffin at left with Prudence Punderson's initials on it, and the cradle at right, which of course notably is being rocked by a Black nursemaid. Possibly, as pointed out in the research of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, this could be a woman named Jane Cato, who we know to have been enslaved within this Connecticut household. In our label text for this work, we lead visitors into a consideration of Jane Cato's perspective, setting aside past interpretations that focus on things like Prudence Punderson or even the domestic interior of a Connecticut household during this era. Although this is almost certainly the only pictorial representation of Jane Cato, this is not someone who relied on the Punderson family to define her personhood, as this picture might have us believe. Jane Cato would go on to secure her freedom. She would marry twice. She lived in the, at that time, quite bustling urban community of New London, Connecticut. And remarkably, she produced a will, which begins with the powerful but simple assertion of self, I, Jane Cato. As we write in the exhibition label, these are traces of someone who otherwise might have been absorbed into the life of another, but they insist on recognition both then and now. I offer these two case studies as examples of how the show invites the visitor to look differently, to really look critically at the works on view as products of white artists and patrons that nonetheless carry the possibility of telling Black stories. By way of another key case in point, the exhibition introduction also includes a suite of images related to an estate north of Baltimore known as Perry Hall, which you're seeing here. Like the previous image of the Windsor household in Massachusetts, this picture was commissioned by white landowners, and it would have been intended to function as an emblem of prestige for this family, demonstrating the wealth and refinement of these family members who are seen here strolling leisurely through their grounds. Now, the names of all of these white subjects are known, having been preserved and repeated as part of the traditional interpretation of this image as an emblem of a white family's prominence and becoming an emblem of their heritage as the picture is interpreted in various spaces over time. But we can choose to follow other lines of inquiry. We're not limited to thinking about the original intention behind the picture. In looking critically, we can think about the Black residents of Perry Hall, who we know were present and worked to construct and maintain this same landscape. Here we actually see the plantation from another angle in an incredibly rare depiction of Black and white laborers at work with agricultural buildings in the background. Whatever the original intention of this image, its meaning changed over time as it descended not in the hands of the white enslavers, but through generations of a Black family formerly enslaved at Perry Hall, known through the generations as the Halls, the Davidges, or the Cummings. So how does our understanding of this work shift when we consider it hanging on the walls of this Black family home in Baltimore in the 19th century? What might this image have represented for this family? Although we can't know the answer to these questions, of course, asking them opens new avenues for interaction with this image. And here's a close-up of some of the laborers that we see at work at Perry Hall, whose descendants then appear in 19th century photographs of members of the Cummings family, who became prominent members of the free Black community in Baltimore, becoming a lawyer in the case of Harry Scythe Cummings, the first African-American to graduate with a law degree from the University of Maryland. And on the right, his sister, Ida Cummings, who became the first African-American kindergarten teacher in Baltimore. So displaying the Perry Hall landscape side by side with such family photographs, we can witness this work as a point of origin for a narrative of African-American heritage, and to see this Black genealogy unfolding through these works, even those that were originally intended for another purpose. Following this introduction to the critical concepts and the scope of the show, the exhibition narrative moves into a gallery approaching the tropes of early portraiture, in which Black figures were included according to the European model of the Black page. Although less common on this side of the Atlantic, this is an insidious artistic convention that made its way to the British American colonies by the turn of the 18th century, especially in Maryland, but also in a few cases further north. And these were images that attempted to connect relatively isolated Anglo-American colonists to the supposedly sophisticated fashions of cosmopolitan centers abroad. At the same time, we can see these paintings now to offer opportunities to explore the realities of Black experience in early New England and the Mid-Atlantic. So a typical composition like this shows a Black child gazing at a white adult in an enactment of the kind of power dynamic that was desired by the white sitter. So emphasizing the authority of the sitter in contrast to the enslaved figure's servile role. We see a rare example of this in this picture, which was made in early 18th century Rhode Island. And it's a family portrait, which really captures the simultaneous distance and proximity central to relationships between enslaved people and enslavers in New England, which is a dynamic sometimes ironically and erroneously referred to as family slavery because of those close quarters that existed between Black and white in that context. So this Black child, like all of the white figures in the picture, is very likely based upon a real person, a familiar member of the household in which he lived, that of the Potter family, who were among the largest enslavers in Rhode Island's Narragansett country, just outside Newport. This is an area that was unique in New England for its sizable farms, worked by relatively high numbers of enslaved laborers, more so than anywhere else in New England. Indeed, nearly 30% of the population of this community, South Kingstown, where the Potters resided, was Black. And that's in contrast to much lower percentages elsewhere, as low as 1 or 2%. So there was a potential actually for a sense of Black community in this area of Rhode Island that upends our expectations of Black history in the region. Here is another remarkable example that takes its cue from the trope of the Black page. And in the background of this otherwise conventional portrait stands a miniaturized Black youth, which you can just see in the overall shot, but I've included a close-up so that you can have a better sense of this really unusual composition. This was made in London for a Boston merchant, and it may well be the earliest depiction of a Black New Englander. Could this be a man named Dick, whose name appears more than once in family papers of the white sitter, as well as in Boston court records? Or might it be Robin, for whom a coat was made by the sitter's tailor at the end of the 1600s? Was he one of the 14 unnamed Black people documented as human property in the 1713 will of the sitter's widow? Although again, we can't answer these questions definitively, asking them while interacting with this image brings us into a contemplative engagement with the histories of Black Boston. Remarkably, of course, we see the Black youth is stationed behind a table stocked with account books and other writing materials. This may well be a member of the sitter's household entourage, such as a young clerk in training. Unlike so many enslaved laborers further south and later in time, the youth is given access to the tools of literacy as a potential form of agency and education commonly denied to Black people. And this is these are circumstances that were not unheard of in colonial New England. We know of a man named Caesar Linden, who was enslaved in Newport, Rhode Island, who was entrusted with household business records. And his work survives in the form of a small account book preserved by the Rhode Island Historical Society, which documents not only the business transactions conducted on behalf of the enslaver, but also the daily activities of Caesar Linden himself, including the planning of a picnic for friends of his. I'm going to turn this over now to RL to take us through the next sections of the exhibition.
Thank you, Emelie. Inspiring as always. I just want to say as I begin that this is my first time working with a museum. And I can now say that I hope it will not be my last. One of the things that is offered to us is the possibility to show different kinds of artifacts, different art forms that may have been looked down upon. And I'll get into that as we go through the images, what that might have looked like in terms of, needlework versus an oil painting, right? In terms of how we can sometimes even racialize forms to the point where the archive itself does not leave us too many options under that framework to find Black presence. And so being at the Folk Art Museum and working with Emelie and Sadé has given us just that opportunity. Among the artifacts that are shown are this headstone. No, we did not do the grave robbing. The desecration of the final resting places of these two enslaved young people, Lanan and Hagar, had already been accomplished. We know that it has been a common travesty that many historical sites, the final resting places of African Americans, have indeed been disturbed in ways that are unnecessary and very, of course, destructive to the archive. Why do I say unnecessary? Because if we had named some of these figures, if we knew the importance of these sites to all of American history, maybe we would have treated them with more care. But this survives one such destruction of a burial ground. And so you will see here, this is taken from Washington County, Rhode Island. It is in the early 18th century. And these are siblings, Lanan and Hagar, who were both buried on the grounds of their enslaver, Christopher Phillips. One thing you will notice is that, guess what? Christopher Phillips' name, his own name, is on the headstone for these two young Black folks, and the relationship is described even on the headstone. So there is I guess a uniqueness. I would call it magnanimous, but I would have to use the SpongeBob font, that he was giving this headstone to mark the graves of his, quote, colored servants. And this was uncommon. But we can see that even though Christopher Phillips in 1727 is saying, oh no, I'm going to do the uncommon thing. I'm going to recognize the final resting place of these two Black servants of mine, Negro servants of mine, colored servants of mine. But my name is going to be in it. So you know who did this, you know how this came about. And thus we get a record of folks that are being known only by the name of their enslaver in this life and the next. And so we can see how this item actually gives us an opportunity to reflect on the way in which the slave-master relationship remained front and center, regardless of the occasion, regardless of how serious or sacred that occasion was. And we get, as a result, a devaluation of the individual identities of both Lanan and Hagar. So you will see in this image, and this is the fullness as you walk into the main atrium space of the gallery, and you'll see that above this tombstone, there is a cylinder. Inside, inscribed on that cylinder, are the names, both of people that were already known to us and we were so excited to delve into, and the names of folks that were uncovered in the course of this research. And so Unnamed Figures is about honoring both those names that we knew, those names that we now know, and those names that we have yet to know. And yet we know that they were present. And so that presence is very important to the show and to us as curators. And so we wanted to have that centrally displayed. Okay. one of the things that I've mentioned it just now about this distinction being made between what is known as fine art and then all that other stuff. Art for, other lower, quote, and you hear my scare quotes, lower purposes, right? We find that Black artists did exist and have always existed in the colonies, but they were kept out of a lot of these spaces where they might have received formal training as a result of racism. Guess what? Racism wasn't only in the South, y'all. I hope you know that. If you didn't know, you're in the right place. This is a good show for you. And so we see that early Black makers, and now we're talking in the 18th and 19th centuries, were often working in vernacular formats, and those formats themselves were marginalized. And so there's a bit of matching of the marginalized person to the marginalized art form. And I think actually there's a bit of comorbidity there as well. And so we have on view here stoneware oyster jar, which was made by Thomas Camara. That's on the left. You can see that he puts writing on them. One of the wonderful things I think about these pieces is that we see that even in what was known as a lesser art form, or an art form that was just for mechanical purposes or for the purposes of carrying out a task, that care was given and care was placed by the artist into these works. Camara is a free Black potter, and he actually had his own business in New York City. Go New York. I saw some folks, from the New York area. It's good to be home. A notable feature of the jar is that stamp, and you'll see it identifies Daniel Johnson, who was a Black New York oysterman, as the owner of the jar. What's interesting about this oyster jar is that it was found not in the United States, but in Guyana. Interestingly, I am half Guyanese, so shout out to, my West Indian and Caribbean peoples. I see you, I love you. So the jar was indeed found in Guyana. Why? Because we can see that Black folks were not static at this time. And so even in the ways that we see the vocabularies of racism and even the policies under slavery developing and evolving over time, we also see that Black folk were mobile throughout, excuse me, these centuries of enslavement. So, right, next slide. All right, so here we have one of my favorites from the collection. I was privileged to be able to put together a bit of research for just it's like a snack. I'm a long-winded writer, so it was difficult. My two co-editors here will know. I was like, why can't I get 2,000 words? And they were like, because it's 1,000. I was like, okay. Excuse me. So I had to trim it down. But the reason I had to trim it down is because I had so many thoughts about what does it mean to have an enslaved man printing, setting type, doing illustrations as an enslaved person in the North. And so here we are back to Boston, and the artisan who produced, set and also created these images, designed these images, is an enslaved printer by the name of Peter Fleet, and he was enslaved by Thomas Fleet, who was a publisher in the area, who said, you know what, let me capitalize on this talent that my slave has, and I'm going to put him on in this way. What is wonderful about this is that you will notice at the bottom of the left page, PF, and that's on the first page. And just in big block letters, he said, PF, I'm going to put my mark on this. And it's declaring an artistic voice in spite of the circumstances under which this art was produced. What is further interesting about Peter Fleet, whom, by the way, is called an ingenious man, who cut on wooden blocks all the pictures which decorated the ballads and small books of his master. So we do have that on record, that he was known. He was known for having a talent. He was known for being, quote, ingenious. And his ingenuity can be seen not only in this image, but in other records of the time, including his will. If you look to the right-hand side, you may notice, I hope uncomfortably, that the devil is depicted, and the devil is depicted in all black. Some of my work, even before beginning this project, was work on the racial meanings of colors and the moral meanings of colors: light, good; black, bad. And so we see that that system of representation active in Peter Fleet's work, and I had such curiosity about what it might have meant, to piggyback off of what Emelie just said about thinking differently, thinking expansively, thinking from the perspective of the Black artist or the Black sitter or the Black person depicted. It really does change things. So what does it mean to use that same racist dichotomy of representation, even when you yourself are a victim of it? Okay, next slide. This gallery also has the work of Prince Dima. And I always just thought that was such a lit name, you know, Prince Dima. I already like Prince, so, you know, I said, you put Dima on that's doing something for me. So Prince Dima is actually also in Boston, and he is an enslaved portraitist. And we have only begun recently to know about Prince Dima. This is one of the idiosyncrasies of the Archive of Black Experience in the States, which is that the timing of some of these uncoveries of records of Black presence have often had to be uncovered by Black folk themselves and their allies. And so these things take time when you are also experiencing all of the worst parts of the system. And so I am very grateful that Prince Dima has returned to us, like many of our ancestors have done. Among the traces of Dima's life is a newspaper advertisement placed by his enslavers, Christian and Henry Barnes, proclaiming Dima's, quote, extraordinary genius and offering his services to the people of Boston. I have said a few times during this tour that, you know, one of the ways that you can judge whether or not it will be considered all right for a Black person to engage in the crafts, to use their gifts, is if it is benefiting their enslaver. And so because of this, we see Black artisans in a very precarious position. On the one hand, not being able to get the formal training to excel in the fine arts, but also not being able to get opportunities for education, except for where that education will provide a material or monetary benefit, or even just a benefit of the ego for their enslavers. So Dima made several paintings, including a self-portrait, but this is one of only 3 by his hand known to have survived. It depicts, and we're now on the right, oh, I'm sorry, am I in the right place? Yes, I think I am. Emelie, I'm looking at y'all. Am I in the right place? Now I'm like looking at the thing. Okay, yeah, I'm good. All right, I'm back with it. Whew, relax, everybody. You're in good hands. All right, so on the right, we are seeing Dima's enslavers. And what's interesting and fascinating, you will notice that these 2 images actually, you know, they look like something happened to them. On the left, you will see a cut. And I said, wait a minute, left, right. Oh no, she got stabbed in the heart. And then on the right, similarly, there has been damage. And we in fact believe that this portrait of Christian Barnes was indeed slashed by patriots. And I'm talking Revolutionary period patriots during a period of iconoclasm that followed that push for independence by the, at that point, very young nation. So we see the violent fury and also the chaos of the revolutionary moment, because this is also the moment at which Prince Dima said, oh, okay, y'all really got a lot going on. Y'all got so much going on. Okay, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna escape. And so he was able to gain his freedom in the 1770s when his loyalist enslavers did indeed flee the colonies. All right. Dima himself died during the war, and I always want to place special emphasis on that. We know now that about 10 to 15% of the soldiers in the Revolutionary War were in fact Black Americans. I'll say it again. Black Americans fought in the Revolutionary War, and then were later during the 19th century excluded from being able to claim that lineage, which is, one of the great travesties, I believe, of American life and representation. Okay, next slide. Thank you so much. So we have a number of examples of Black schoolgirl needlework. I said, okay, Black girl magic. So we saw this medium as something that is also similarly put to the side for reasons of gender-based discrimination, but also for reasons of access and limited access that comes about, on the other hand, as a part of that kind of separation of the gender roles and what spaces were young women going to be able to use their artistic talents. But we have records, and this is a sampler by Sarah Ann Major Harris, and she documents her family tree in this genealogical work. And it's giving a very, in my mind, revolutionary act, because at this time, we also know that Black families were under very much pressure and danger and undermining by the system in which they found themselves. And so what is additionally remarkable about this example is that this young woman was indeed also an activist. And she became the first Black girl to gain admittance to the Prudence Crandall School in Canterbury, Connecticut. Now, think of it. When we want to work together in the fields as indentured servants, white indentured servants and Black slaves, that's fine. We're making that money. But can we be educated together? Can our children play together? We see in the record that the school was indeed closed because all of the white parents at this time said, oh, I'm not sending my child to that school if a Black girl is going to be there with them. And so one of the wonderful things about being able to show this these works, is that we also have works by young white children. And so we can see the ways in which children are still, even in such a toxic representational environment, are still trying to reach out to one another, still trying to join one another. And so I found that to be one of the more touching moments of the research. Okay, next slide. Another consideration for us is the landscape. So when we look at examples such as this one, which is an 18th century overmantel, meaning it would be in the home. This is something that would be viewed in the domestic space, not only by white folks, but also by Black folks who may have come through the home to either serve in it or to service it. But we have the appearance in this overmantel of Black figures and indeed Indigenous figures in spaces that have historically been overlooked as sites of Black habitation. So this is where the absence that we see in the archive, we know is intentional. It is orchestrated, either by inaction or by deliberate erasure. At the same time, here we have a picture. Where are the people? What are you talking about? Unnamed figures. I don't see any figures. One of the things that is a method for creating these absences, for creating these erasures, is just to show us a location. And we see, the home, and the image, I think, in this case, is relying upon the viewer's imagination to populate it. Well, of course, if we populate it, we would populate it based upon what we've been sort of swimming in as the narrative about this period. And it's giving, oh, well, this is probably a white neighborhood. Not so. So although the landscape, which is by Ralph Earl, has been historically interpreted in terms of this wealthy white family who owned this house and general store that is depicted within it, it gives us also an opportunity to remember the free Black Phillips family, whose agricultural work gave shape to and maintained the landscape. And so this idea that, oh, well, there's no one there, it belies the record that we have found, and that it would encourage all of you all to continue to seek out, because there can be clues. One of the most joyful parts, I think, of this process was the opportunity that we had to actually interview descendants of folks that we were able to name. And this is one example from a Phillips descendant, Bonnie Johnson. And she spoke about the landscape and said, when I first saw it, the image doesn't look like it's inclusive. But as I thought about it and looked at it more, it also gives me a sense of place. I'm from there. I grew up there. My ancestors have been there as long as white New Englanders have. So this research, is, I think, a part of a puzzle piece of a larger work that is going on, I think, around the country, that is coming from scholars who are interested in saying, let's set the record straight. Black folk have been here, and let's remember their presence. Now, I have also here a quote from Eleanor Meir, and this is returning back to the Van Bergen overmantel, which we have just seen. And Eleanor shares something that really gave me chills to hear. She says, looking at this early 18th century overmantel, which possibly does depict her own ancestors, she says, it's like all of a sudden, there's a hand on your shoulder, tapping on your shoulder, saying, here I am. Presence, even in absence, is vetted. It's vetted knowledge. And so part of, I think, the mission of the show has been to try and uncover some of those things for a wider audience, so that we can all participate and see that shared history. Sadé, it is on to you.
Appreciate it. You're going to be a hard act to follow, so I will try nonetheless. So we have other works in the show that look to the developments in Black representation in the 19th century, focusing on how Americans have come to remember and misremember Black history in the North. In the 19th century, historical memory was a really powerful force at play in the construction of local identity, which both Emelie and RL have already sort of commented on. And scholars have shown how in the decades following the Revolution in New England in particular, the politics of patriotism, emancipation, abolition, and ultimately the Civil War really transformed white residents' thinking about their past, inflecting the history of their own region with a willful forgetting of local slavery and replacing it with a moralizing anti-slavery, anti-Southern stance. But in this monumental landscape, Winter Scene in Brooklyn, we're offered a subtle example of how Black stories have been both remembered and forgotten. From his studio window, artist Francis Guy recorded the everyday activities of several of his Black neighbors in what is now downtown Brooklyn. Among them, a man at work, sawing tree branches, as you can see here, two men selling coal, and a figure pushing a wheelbarrow. At the center, there's a man that passes through an open gate, and he's carrying a bucket. And historical sources identify him simply as Jeff. He was a servant in the household of Abel Titus. Not pictured in this particular representation, but in others that I painted, chimney sweep. And he's recorded as living in High Street in Brooklyn during the period. Though seemingly diverse and inclusive, the landscape contains visual cues that maintain a racial hierarchy. The white figures in the painting stroll in elegant clothes, while the Black community members are depicted as laborers or positioned as for comic relief, with one man who sort of sprawled on his back in the snow. Notably, though, in the later 19th century, there's a key that identifies various figures in the Brooklyn scenes. And the Black individuals, however, go mostly unnamed and unremembered, noting mostly only the white figures in the scene. Only Jeff and Foster are identified on this key that you see here. Next slide. This picture provides an example of the hunger for early images of Black people, even to the extent of inventing them. This supposed portrait of a Black man reveals itself through X-ray to be a doctored image, repainted sometime in the 20th century, the early 20th century, to transform this white man into a far rarer and more remarkable fiction of Black heritage. Charles Lee Jones, the purported sitter of this doctored portrait, was previously posited as the son of the prominent religious leader, Reverend Absalom Jones, a co-founder of the nation's first African-American church in Philadelphia. However, there are no records of the existence of Charles. Jones seems to not have had any children at all. Next slide. But there were increasing opportunities in the 19th century for Black Northerners to seek out representations of themselves, like this example we see here. These extraordinary portraits of a husband and wife are among the most striking representations of Black sitters in the early antebellum North. Still, at a time when commissioning oil portraits of Black sitters remained a rarity, a convergence of favorable circumstances, including the subject's affluence, their social networks, were really required to pave the way for this kind of a fashionable likeness. William Lawson was a clothing dealer, which was a prominent profession among the Black community that would have brought middle-class prosperity to him and his family. And he and his wife, Nancy, may have also known the artist, William Matthew Pryor, through common religious or possibly abolitionist connections. Amid a society rife with racism, Pryor was particularly unusual as a white artist who painted several sitters of African descent, including members of the Copeland family, who, like the Lawsons, operated a business on Blackstone Street in Boston. Although Pryor was known to offer a range of portraiture options, including some that were more plain in style, the Lawsons clearly chose to represent themselves with a high degree of finish and sophistication. You can see Nancy Lawson, it has this beautiful dress and jewelry and a ribboned cap, and really just rich with texture and on both their parts. But significantly, you can see Nancy's thumb is tucked into a book, which highlights her literacy. And this is a very common accessory among educated sitters of this era. But the book would have been of even greater significance for her at a time when literacy held a special symbolism for Black aspirations to equality. Next slide. Okay, so still there are many portraits of Black subjects where white priorities were really sort of pushed to the forward, and we wanted to highlight that in this section. So, for example, in this depiction from Bangor, Maine, we have Jeremiah Pearson Hardy, painting Abraham Hansen, and Abraham Hansen was really a well-known barber in the town at this time, which was a respected occupation in the Black community. And he was recognized as good-natured, he's witty, and a very charitable man with a solid business. And this likeness survives as an indication of his status as a popular local figure who was deemed worthy, in the words of an early local historian, to have his portrait painted. So, of course, upon initial inspection, this representation appears to be respectful. The increasing democratic nature of portraiture in the early 19th century provided Black people with opportunities to participate in the production of images of themselves. However, the painting's origin story reveals how Black portraiture could remain subject to white terms. Reportedly, the artist did not make this portrait for Hansen to keep, but really to enhance his own skill by experimenting with what was, to him, an unfamiliar skin tone. So rather than hanging in the family home like so many portraits of white sitters, this picture remained in Hardy's studio for an advertisement. The artist's abilities. Next slide, yeah, thanks. Efforts to shape a Black identity based on freedom and shared sense of dignity were targeted by white visual culture in the early 19th century. Illustrated series this one, the Abolition broadsides, emerged in Boston as an especially poisonous example of white fear. As seen here, the broadsides were vicious satires of this annual Black celebration of the abolition of the slave trade, organized by a mutual aid group, the African Society. They consisted of mock declarations written in derisive parodies of African American vernacular, for example, abolition as opposed to abolition, as a means of undermining the agency and pride of a Black public demonstration. Such images as these really turn Black people into cartoons, relying on this newly crystallized stereotype of Black physiognomy. As you can kind of see here, the really broad noses and the large lips. Today, these broadsides survive as a record not only of racism, but of the profound bravery and perseverance of Black Bostonians who participated in such events and other forms of activism. Against the intensifying disdain and even violence of white community members, groups like the African Society banded together to advocate for the rights of Black Americans. The abolition broadsides testified to Black determination to memorialize and honor their own history in spite of ongoing oppression. Next. Thanks. This image was likely created during the post-Civil War Reconstruction period amid an influx of degrading popular images of Black people, and it reflects the racist visual vocabulary of that time. It could draw on satirical series that were popular, such as Darktown, which was produced by New York City prominent printmaking firm Currier and Ives. And these images, this one and the Currier and Ives prints, usually depicted newly freed Blacks that were trying and failing to imitate white middle-class gentility. For many of the white consumers, these publications provided a humorous outlet that eased their growing uncertainty about integration after emancipation. Painted portraits and photographs featuring dignified Black sitters stood in as counterpoints to the scathing stereotypes and grotesque figures that were seen here. This work is originally, we don't know what the title would have been when it was painted. It's now referred to as Town Scene. But it was created at a moment of increased Black self-fashioning through images. But despite these competing representations, images of Black dysfunction continue to inform white perceptions into the 20th century. In 1942, for example, the pioneering folk art collector Jean Lippman purchased this painting, and she called it Darkytown. Likely, she was informed by these earlier prints that I mentioned, but her retitling renewed efforts to undermine Black upward mobility nonetheless. And then next slide. In contrast to these caricatures that we've seen, and even to oil painting as a medium that remained predominantly white, photography offered a new format for Black self-representation. Photography had a profound impact on the lives of Black Americans in the 19th century, as the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass powerfully attested, as you can see here with his quotes. Though readily available photographic portraits, African Americans now had the power to create and control their own images. Photography made it possible to demonstrate personal style and respectability, and wealth and family ties, becoming a medium of empowerment through dignified and individualized self-representation. Early formats like the daguerreotype were very cumbersome and expensive to make, but by mid-century, there were other options like the carte de visite and cabinet cards that made image making far more accessible. The small size and uniform shape of many of the works seen here made them easy to carry around and display and pass off as gifts to friends and family. The photographs in the exhibition, and really all of these photographs of Black sitters in the 19th century, really demonstrate a flourishing Black creative agency during the second half of the 19th century, including stately individual portraits of Black sitters in smart suits and dresses like this one, depicting how their subjects wanted to be seen and understood. Personalities on full display in our galleries with fancy hats and striking hairstyles, as well as a range of facial expressions anywhere from serious to sentimental. Individually and as a group, these images are remarkable documents of Black achievement, determination, dignity, and aspiration, a powerful, visible response to racial stereotyping and the ongoing erasure of Black people in visual culture of the dominant American society. So I will just close by plugging the book. We had the opportunity to do a lovely and wonderful scholarly anthology. It encompasses both emerging voices and renowned scholars, including a foreword from Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw. So hopefully you all will get a chance to check that out. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that we are really excited to be able to travel this show. So if you miss it in New York City, where it will be through March 24th of 2024, you can see it in Massachusetts at Historic Deerfield from May 1st to August 4th, 2024. And also look out for details on our upcoming scholarly symposium, which will be in February and March next year, if you're interested in hearing more scholarship related to the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ade, Ariel, and Emelie, for this engaging overview of the exhibition. Before we take some questions from the audience, I would love to take a moment to talk a little bit about the installation and see how the installation reflects your research for the exhibition. As you pointed earlier, Emelie, you in this exhibition refocused your attention on question about Black presence and absence, even though the answers may elude you. So I would love to have you talk a little bit more about how you translated this work of refocusing in the exhibition design, and how you approach idea of absence and lack in the space of the museum.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can start by just saying that as RL alluded to, the breadth of available material that the concept of folk art opens us up to was really important in us being able to kind of look beyond, types of painting that might be considered part of the art historical canon, and to consider other types of objects that perhaps are not in art museums, even they're in historical societies, or they're in local collections. And so that was a really important way to be able to focus our selection. But we also did make use of some subtle, but we hope impactful ways of orienting the viewer to the curatorial goals within the design of the show. So introducing our kind of critical framework for the show from the beginning, allowing us to use a little bit more text than we might usually do, but also even reorganizing the way the text appears on the labels. For instance, if you go see the show in person, which I really hope you will, because there's so many rich stories, you'll notice usually the information about an object is at the top of a label in a museum exhibition, but we decided we wanted to put that below the interpretation, because if you just look, as actually someone in the Q&A has very astutely pointed out, if you just look at the titles of paintings or works of art, you actually don't you don't register the Black presence. And indeed, those titles are really not relevant for our purposes. And I think a lot of people don't know those titles are often invented much later. They have nothing to do with the artist's original intention. They were titles made up in, like, the 20th century by a dealer who needed to describe something in order to sell it. So putting that information second and making it clear visually, that doesn't have to be the first thing that you look at. It's not actually the thing that we're suggesting here should be the focus. And then together with that, we chose to highlight the names of Black individuals connected to works of art by bolding those graphically in the text as well. So you see a reflection of the focus through the graphic design of the show. So those were just a few ways that we tried to subtly assert the potential to think differently about presence and absence.
I think this leads me to another question regarding the importance of text in the exhibition and attention to language as well. I wanted to have you talk about the work of rewriting titles, labels, and description, and why it's so important for this exhibition, and why it was a major part of your curatorial work, and how also did you create a balance between the artworks and the interpretation inside the gallery. As you can see here on the screen, we have a nice balance between images and text. So yeah, if you can also expand on that. Maybe Ariel, you want to take this one?
I can come in. I work with text. So my area of undergraduate teaching is African American literature, and so for me, text that's my water. I swim in it, and so one of the things, though, that can come of increasing engagement with folks coming through the show by giving them more robust textual analysis for each piece is that we are actually walking into the wind. We are walking uphill against a lot of representations and the habits of reception that have been ingrained in viewers when looking at African American figures. And so the section in which we discuss visual vocabularies of racism, which Sadé has shared with you all, and I think someone in the comments called it garish, and I said, that's a word. I just said I love words. I said garish. It's giving grotesque. And so if we're used to seeing those kinds of images, and then we're used to getting a message about Black servitude, Black happiness under the slave system. There were no slaves in the North. If you see an empty scene, you're never really going to assume Black presence unless it is, unpacked for you. And in the final place, I will just say, I'm sure there are many other things I could talk about, but the last thing I will say on this is the act of looking is something that can often be done passively by default. So we go to a museum to be shown some stuff, and we're just going to be in here and look at it. It's like, what do you mean when you say look? What are the politics of looking? What is the content of that looking that we may be unaware of when we go into a museum if we remain in that kind of passively receptive space? And I think what adding some more text as a kind of helper for patrons of the museum to take a more active stance. Reading itself is a mode of engagement that requires you got to turn those wheels a little bit to receive a text in a way that if the image is by itself and we just have a title, folks, those are not the places that folks would be able to go, in part because a lot of the information that's coming out of the research may be new to some folks looking at these images. And so we were hoping to disrupt some of those habits of looking that do not actually tell the full story or empower us as viewers.
Yeah,
So
and
Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to follow up on that, that I think because one of our main goals was to have people look again at works that they'd seen before. I mean, many of these are highlights of other collections, and so people have encountered them before. And so asking people to look at it again and to see the way that we've reinterpreted it or refocused. I think to RL's point, the reading that we're asking you to do is sort of uncovering what hasn't been said or what hasn't been assumed about these works in other interpretations or just in reading the title of the work. So I think that was significant. And one of the works we didn't talk about in our presentation actually has had a title sort of rewrite, and there are museums that are thinking about retitling works. We had a discussion about the town scene or Darky Town work that I discussed in terms of how we wanted to present it, like what title we wanted to use, and why. And so I think this conversation about titling is one that a lot of museums are having right now around these kinds of works. And so we're happy to be part of that larger conversation.
Yeah, there's a great article by Jennifer Van Horn and Virginia Anderson, who's a curator of American art at the Baltimore Museum of Art, talking about about Baltimore's decision to retitle one of the works in the show. So for those who are interested in those kinds of questions, definitely check out the article. And also Sadé's article in the book, which discusses Darky Town and its different moments across time and how it's been titled.
Yes, and we will also study those questions for during the symposium on February 23rd and March 8th. So you should check that also on our website for more information if you want to attend. We will have a lot of curators and art historians who will come and discuss those questions and how we reconsider object from a collection of early American art and material culture. But to continue on the exhibition, Unnamed Figures and new work as a team, I would love also to talk about the role of oral history in your research, and maybe Emelie, if you can go back 2 slides back. I think there is an image. Oh no, one forward. Sorry. No, 2, yeah. No, just 2 forward, 2 back. When you see the landscape and we can, so it's this one, yes. And so in this installation view, you see that there are some devices to hear some stories, and I would love for you, and you mentioned it also, IL, in your presentation, how we can engage with those landscapes through the family descendants. And so you recorded their memories and you made them available. And so I wanted to have you talk about the role of oral history in the study of African American representation, if you want to tell us a little bit more about that.
One of the things that has really greatly frustrated me about finding some traces of Black presence is that there is both presence and absence existing at the same time, right? So we're both here and not here. So we know that folks who are working on creating and constructing a Black dialect as white authors, and I would put on this list, Mark Twain, Herman Melville does a little bit of it, Harry Beecher Stowe surely. So we have a lot of examples of white authors writing dialogue or dialect for Black characters, and even in some cases, actual Black people, as in the case of the Babolition broadside. What I find most frustrating is that these kinds of dialect, reproductions of dialect, are not in fact faithful productions of the African American English vernacular. They just aren't. They don't follow the rules of the vernacular, these rules of the vernacular that we know through oral histories and through linguistic development. It would be impossible for both Mark Twain and my great-grandmama to be correct. I'm choosing my great-grandmama. She was Black, and she was the first generation born outside of enslavement. So one of the things that, excuse me, one of the things that I teach on is, what is the purpose of disrupting a reader's experience of the text? In this case, a reader is, it's standard English, they're flying through, and then all of a sudden we come to something like Bobolition. Well, if you don't know this basic lie that I'm informing you about now, so now you could say, if you know, and hopefully you'll tell a friend, because Black people were not calling abolition Bobolition. That is not what this piece is doing. This piece is not documenting difference, and a difference that, we want to say, okay, in the present day, we respect this kind of difference. No, that's a difference that was manufactured. And there are a lot of ways in which an accent was turned into what could be read as improper, incorrect, guttural, kind of inferior English. When in reality, the Black English vernacular is just that. It is Black vernacular speech, and as such does have grammatical rules, syntax rules, and the like. So one of the ways to resist this is to stay in your body and stay in yourself during the looking moment, and even during the reading moment. Ask yourself, is this really what a Black person in Mark Twain's time sounded like? Is this it? Is he correct? So, as I say, stay active, keep yourself in the mix, and trust yourself as a reader, as a looker, as a participant. Trust yourself that your gut may in fact be right, that there is something fishy going on, and we know that was extremely common.
Talking about something fishy, another subject, it's also, we have a question about the altered portrait of Charles Jones. Which another conversation, but I wanted, someone asked, Clay Beal asked, how many other altered fake portraits of African Americans have you come across in the research of this project?
That's a great question. And an interesting one to, I think it's important to note how unusual it is to be able to present this this information and to be able to show this portrait again, and it was included in an exhibition, really important, influential exhibition curated by Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw in the early 21st century. And she actually, in the foreword for the book, writes about the experience of discovering that this picture that she had included to mean one thing is in fact doctored. And so I really encourage you to have a look at that, as well as another article in the book on the technical examination process and looking at this by Gordon Wilkins, curator at the Addison Gallery of American Art, where this picture is now housed. But I think we can't say enough how unusual it is to be able to dissect this history. I can't answer the question of how many other fakes are out there very accurately, because we just don't know. This is not something that people often want to talk about. These discoveries do not often come easily to light. There is one other picture which is also referenced by Gwendolyn Shaw in the foreword, known as the Black Admiral, which is on Wikipedia. You can look that up, and that's another example of a depiction of a white figure that was painted over. This, interestingly, I was visiting the museum with a conservator friend recently who was suggesting that there could be elements, rather than just a painting over, there was a scraping down of paint involved in doing this doctoring, because the underlayer of a portrait would have had a brown skin tone to it. And so you, I think, can see some evidence of that as well. So interesting to think about how this was actually achieved. But there are unfortunately fakes out there, and it's a cynical, I think cynical motivations behind it, because there is such a desire for these works that they are more commercially appealing than, the simple portrait of an unknown white man that we're seeing in the shadows here.
And not necessarily a fake in the same way as this, where we have evidence that's been painted over, but there is another object in the same section of and that historically people thought was of a man named Paul Cuffey. And there's not structurally a Paul Cuffey. So something similar, but not quite as
yes,
misnaming a figure. It's not quite as serious as like painting over another figure, but that's something else that's in the show.
Yeah, and I think that kind of wishful thinking happens quite a lot, and is not cynical in the same way, but that there's this desire to associate an identity with paintings that don't have the evidence behind them, which is also a really interesting example of what we've been talking about.
And maybe to end our conversation, I wanted to share some thoughts from a speaker we had last year, Jason Young, an historian specializing in the history of the 19th century, who was also co-creator of a show at the Met, Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. And so during our conversation, we mentioned the gaps in the archive related to the history of African-American people in the US, and he said something that really stayed on me with me. He said the most important historical gap has been the lack of attention. Once we turn to these materials, once we take them seriously, it turns out that we know a lot more than we thought we did. And so I would love for you to maybe expand on that and let me know if you experience the same sentiment while you were making this exhibition and doing this research.
Absolutely. In fact, I keep thinking that one of the first things when I, brought this project to our director, at the very beginning of the idea for it, I said, I don't know if we could do this because I just don't know that there's going to be enough material. That was my primary concern. And we really proved ourselves wrong in that. But I also think it's about, as we said, asking the questions anyway, because I actually think that's one of the methodological issues that has posed so many barriers to doing this kind of work in the past, and that's what we see, across museums that are doing this kind of work. And to answer another question a really good question in the chat about our use of speculation in the show has been really important and based again on methodologies that we're seeing in scholarship that are making their way to the museum of cultural historians like Saidiya Hartman, who uses a concept that she calls critical fabulation. Also the work of Jennifer Van Horn in her new book, Portraits of Resistance, which talks a lot about and actually gives kind of a specific framework in her introduction about how she uses this may have been, we think possibly, we don't know, but it's you can't do this work without getting comfortable with uncertainty and pushing through that. We're not trying to manufacture a degree of certainty that doesn't exist, but you have to sit with that or it becomes impossible to pursue the work at all. And so I think that's a really important, opening yourself up to a framework that is perhaps different from past methodologies.
I can say on this, Mathilde, that and in answer to the question, thank you for that question also about speculation, because if we did not speculate, if we did not reconstruct, I think of it in the same way archaeologists and paleontologists can find one bone and work with it to tell you something that can help you approximate the whole, and wait until such time as another bone comes back, and it comes back, and it comes back, you know, as the earth gives it up. So the work of studying Black culture, Black history, Black presence, and Black absence does require a little bit more uncomfortable questions that hang in the air, and they have to be allowed to hang there, because the alternative to letting the question hang is accepting every bad thing that has been said about Black folk. And so I often say that there is no choice, in fact, for Black people. And so returning also to the questioner who asked about the importance of a name, that is priceless. It is priceless. It cannot be overestimated, because a name can give someone peace to know that what they received through oral history, what they received through even their own experience, and the continuing line between their ancestral experience and their current experience is not broken. It can be found. And if we continue to act as though it can be found, we will find things, as we did. There were so many things we found that we just didn't have space for. I mean, even today, I was like, dang, I didn't even get to talk about Benjamin Banneker, man. You know, and so there are riches there. And again, the alternative nature of the approach, the alternative nature of the methodology is a must for being able to get even reliable information and to be asking the right questions.
Sadé, would you like to add something to this idea of what did you experience with this research? Were you surprised also?
I mean, I think Emelie and RL have said, I mean, pretty thoroughly about what our experience was doing the work. And I think, I mean, definitely I agree with this idea that if you go looking, you're going to find things. And I think what is cool about having all of these works in one place, which again was something that we were just really excited about, was to be able to pull all of these together, is that once they're in conversation, like, you know, aside from the actual, you know, like scholarly research that we're doing and the genealogical research that we're doing, allowing people to just spend time with the work itself and looking at what's in the images. Somebody made a comment in the comments about the background behind Mrs. Lawson being really interesting. And I mean, that in of itself, like what's happening back there, and how does that relate to her and her choices for this work? I mean, that is exploratory as well. So I think putting these works in conversation also helps along this idea of what you can find when you go looking and really digging into the visuals of the artwork itself.
Yeah. And don't limit yourself by source. A kitchen receipt. We had, what was it, Emelie? It was some fashions that somebody.
Oh yeah, the Taylor's bills from
Samuel
the
Shrimpton.
17th century.
Okay.
Samuel Shrimpton, you know,
Court
household
documents, arrests, postings, little personal ads, you know, that it's there. It's there.
And you know, a lot of this research too, it's like we did not do all of this research independently. We did a lot of research, but a lot of it is already out there, and it's part of the work of present day historians, but also it's in, you know, the histories, local histories written in the 19th and 20th century, and that material just hasn't been, as Sadé was saying, it hasn't been brought together in this way in a context where I think there's the additional mnemonic power of the image. So I think it must be, you know, as a number of historians have said, this is, for whatever reason, this is work that's been out there that just isn't infiltrating the popular imagination fully. So there's still this idea that slavery in the North in particular wasn't very much of an issue, or it was somehow benign. But the hope is that by gathering these works together and placing them in conversation and creating that mnemonic power, there is bringing the material to new light.